Somebody told me that the UK has a problem with Muslims that USA does not. Something about rape gangs. What's that about?
The claim you're referencing likely pertains to a complex and highly sensitive issue that has been the subject of much debate and controversy in the UK. Specifically, there have been cases involving so-called grooming gangs, groups of men who targeted and exploited vulnerable young women and girls. What happened? In several towns and cities across the UK, such as Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford, investigations uncovered networks of men, predominantly of South Asian, often Pakistani Muslim heritage, who were involved in the sexual exploitation of minors over extended periods. Reports like the J Report, 2014, found that local authorities failed to act despite evidence, due to a mix of incompetence, fear of being labeled racist, and a lack of support for victims. Why is this seen as a Muslim problem? While not all grooming gangs in the UK involve individuals from Muslim backgrounds, some high-profile cases have predominantly featured men from certain ethnic and religious groups. This led to allegations of cultural factors contributing to the crimes, such as misogyny or the marginalization of women. However, experts stress that sexual exploitation isn't unique to any one community. Most sexual abuse offenders in both the UK and the USA are white men. The UK's cases of grooming gangs represent a specific subset of crimes that have received intense media focus, which can skew perceptions. How is the UK addressing this? The UK has implemented stricter measures, including legal reforms, tougher sentencing, and enhanced focus on victim protection. Community engagement, programs to address cultural norms and build trust with law enforcement. Independent inquiries, to investigate institutional failures and ensure accountability. How does this compare to the USA? The specific phenomenon of grooming gangs hasn't been reported in the USA in the same way. This difference may be due to variations in demographics, societal structures, or media focus. The USA has its own issues with systemic sexual abuse, e.g., trafficking rings, institutional abuse in religious organizations, but they manifest differently. If you'd like, I can provide a more detailed analysis or specific examples to help clarify further.
Can you expand on the J Report?
Certainly. The J Report, 2014, was a comprehensive investigation led by Professor Alexis J into child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, a town in South Yorkshire, England. It revealed harrowing details of abuse and systemic failures by authorities that allowed the abuse to persist over many years. Here's a deeper dive into the key findings and reasons behind the failures. Key findings of the J Report. Extent of abuse. The report identified at least 1,400 children who were sexually exploited in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. Victims, many of them girls as young as 11, were subjected to rape, trafficking, abduction, physical and emotional abuse, and threats of violence. Offenders often used grooming techniques, offering gifts, alcohol, and drugs to manipulate their victims. Perpetrators. While the majority of offenders in the high-profile cases were men of Pakistani heritage, the report emphasized that sexual exploitation is not confined to one ethnic group. The focus on this demographic led to concerns about cultural factors, including attitudes towards women and girls. Institutional failures. Agencies like the police, social services, and local councils were found to have ignored or downplayed victims' reports for years. Some victims who came forward were treated with hostility or disbelief. Why did authorities fail to act? Fear of being labeled racist. Authorities hesitated to take action because they feared accusations of racism or Islamophobia due to the ethnic background of many perpetrators. This fear was compounded by a broader societal reluctance to discuss or address cultural practices within minority communities. Lack of support for victims. Many victims came from vulnerable backgrounds, such as children in foster care or low-income families. They were often dismissed as troubled or complicit in their exploitation, rather than treated as victims. Authorities failed to provide adequate resources or safe spaces for them to report abuse. Incompetence and institutional apathy. There was a lack of training and understanding among professionals about how to recognize and respond to grooming and exploitation. Bureaucratic inefficiencies and interagency miscommunication allowed cases to fall through the cracks. Underestimation of the problem. Reports of abuse were often dismissed as isolated incidents rather than recognized as part of a larger, systemic problem. Even when patterns emerged, there was a reluctance to confront the issue because it required addressing uncomfortable truths. Aftermath and reforms. The J report spurred widespread outrage and prompted the UK government to take several actions. Accountability. Several officials resigned or were dismissed, including senior figures in Rotherham's council and police force. The government took over control of Rotherham Council for a period due to its mishandling of the situation. Policy changes. Greater emphasis was placed on improving the training of police and social workers. Multi-agency teams were created to tackle child exploitation, involving close collaboration between police, councils, and charities. Cultural shift. Public awareness campaigns aimed to remove stigma from victims and encourage reporting. Efforts to address cultural attitudes and ensure better integration of minority communities were initiated. Broader implications. The fear of being labeled racist, while understandable in a politically sensitive context, had devastating consequences for victims. It revealed the dangers of political correctness overriding justice and highlighted the need for authorities to act decisively against crime, regardless of cultural sensitivities. If you want to explore related cases or the broader societal impact, let me know.
Is this happening anywhere else in the world? Where?
Child sexual exploitation and similar crimes occur worldwide, but the specific phenomenon of organized grooming gangs, as seen in cases like Rotherham in the UK, has not been widely reported in the same structured form elsewhere. However, systemic exploitation of vulnerable children takes different forms across the globe. Below are examples of similar crimes in other regions, along with contributing factors and societal responses. Europe, Netherlands and Germany. Cases of organized sexual exploitation of minors have surfaced, involving trafficking rings exploiting vulnerable children, often migrant or low-income individuals. Reports suggest that marginalized groups, such as unaccompanied refugee minors, are particularly at risk. France. There have been cases of systemic sexual abuse involving trafficking rings targeting young girls for prostitution, often in urban and suburban areas. Authorities have identified vulnerabilities among immigrant communities and runaways as significant risk factors. Sweden. Instances of child exploitation and trafficking, including cases involving asylum seekers or undocumented children, have been reported. These crimes often go underreported due to fear among victims of deportation or mistrust of authorities. United States. In the USA, sexual exploitation tends to take the form of human trafficking networks rather than community-based grooming gangs. Human trafficking. The National Human Trafficking Hotline identifies thousands of cases annually, with children being trafficked for sex work by organized criminal networks. Institutional abuse. High-profile cases like the Jeffrey Epstein scandal highlighted how powerful individuals could exploit minors while evading justice for years. Online exploitation. The rise of technology has led to a significant increase in online grooming, where perpetrators target children via social media or gaming platforms. South Asia. India. Child exploitation is prevalent, with girls from impoverished or rural areas being trafficked for forced labor, marriage, or prostitution. Grooming often occurs in the form of promises of work, education, or marriage, and victims are sometimes trafficked across state or international borders. Pakistan. Reports of child abuse rings, such as the Kaysar child abuse scandal, 2015, have shocked the nation. In this case, hundreds of children were exploited in the Punjab region, with perpetrators using videos to blackmail victims. Authorities have been accused of corruption or inaction, further victimizing survivors. Africa. Nigeria. Boko Haram and other militant groups have engaged in systemic sexual exploitation of kidnapped girls, including forced marriages and trafficking. In more urbanized areas, poverty drives trafficking and child prostitution. South Africa. Sexual violence is a significant issue, and trafficking rings target both boys and girls for exploitation. Southeast Asia. Thailand and the Philippines. Known hotspots for child sex tourism, often involving foreign perpetrators. Organized exploitation frequently involves trafficking of children into brothels or online exploitation, with webcam-based abuse becoming a growing concern. Indonesia. Traffickers target children from rural areas for exploitation in urban centers or abroad. Victims are often groomed with promises of legitimate work opportunities. Global online grooming. The Internet has created a new frontier for child exploitation. International grooming and abuse have escalated with the rise of social media, gaming platforms, and encrypted communication apps. Interpol and other agencies have identified dark web networks that operate globally to share explicit material and coordinate grooming activities. Key similarities across regions. Vulnerable children, e.g., from low-income families, migrant backgrounds, foster care, are consistently targeted. Grooming and exploitation often thrive where law enforcement is weak, under-resourced, or hindered by corruption. Fear of social stigma, victim blaming, or systemic failures contribute to underreporting and ongoing abuse. What's being done internationally? Global efforts. Organizations like Interpol, UNICEF, and the International Labour Organization, ILO, work to combat trafficking and exploitation. Public awareness campaigns and technological solutions are being deployed to monitor online abuse. Legislation. Many countries have introduced harsher penalties for traffickers and abusers, along with efforts to protect victims. Cross-border collaborations aim to dismantle trafficking networks and share intelligence. Grassroots initiatives. Local NGOs and survivor-led organizations often play a critical role in supporting victims and advocating for systemic change. If you'd like, I can delve deeper into specific cases or initiatives addressing these issues worldwide.
Sorry, I was not clear about what I meant by this. So I'll clarify. Is systemic police neglect toward applying laws to Muslims happening anywhere else in the world? Where?
The question of systemic neglect and applying laws to specific communities, including Muslims, has been raised in various countries, though the circumstances and contexts vary significantly. Accusations of leniency or neglect can stem from a range of factors, including political sensitivities, fear of backlash, or challenges with integration and multiculturalism. Examples of alleged police neglect. Sweden. There have been debates about law enforcement being overly cautious when addressing crime in areas with large immigrant populations, including Muslim-majority communities, out of fear of being labeled racist or xenophobic. Critics argue that this hesitancy has allowed problems like gang-related violence and honor-based crimes to persist. France. French authorities have been accused of neglecting issues like radicalization or honor-related violence within certain communities. Some critics claim this is due to concerns over social cohesion and avoiding accusations of Islamophobia. However, France also faces criticism for being excessively heavy-handed in other cases, such as its approach to secularism and bans on religious symbols. Germany. Reports of no-go zones in areas with high immigrant populations, where law enforcement is allegedly hesitant to intervene, have sparked controversy. While many officials deny the existence of such zones, critics suggest police sometimes avoid confrontation in these neighborhoods. India. In some regions, there are allegations of leniency towards certain groups to avoid communal tensions. Conversely, in other areas, the Muslim community faces claims of disproportionate police action, reflecting the highly polarized nature of these debates in India. Belgium. Following terrorist attacks in cities like Brussels, Belgian authorities faced criticism for overlooking signs of radicalization in certain neighborhoods due to concerns about racial profiling and political sensitivity. Broader context. While systemic neglect can be a factor, it's essential to understand that these issues are often tied to broader challenges. Multiculturalism, balancing cultural sensitivity with law enforcement can lead to accusations of either neglect or discrimination. Social integration. Police in many countries are tasked with addressing crime while fostering trust in communities that may already feel marginalized. Political dynamics. Fear of backlash from political groups, media, or public opinion can sometimes influence policing decisions. If you'd like, I can provide a more in-depth analysis of a specific country or region.
Please compare to the USA.
When comparing the phenomenon of systemic police neglect toward applying laws in Muslim communities in the UK or other parts of the world to the United States, several key differences emerge. These differences are rooted in the distinct cultural, demographic, and legal landscapes of each country. Demographics and community dynamics. UK and Europe. Many Western European countries, including the UK, have experienced significant Muslim immigration over the past few decades, often from former colonies, e.g., South Asians in the UK, North Africans in France. Immigrant Muslim communities in Europe tend to live in concentrated areas, leading to ethnic enclaves. These areas have sometimes been stigmatized as no-go zones, a term often exaggerated, or areas where police hesitate to enforce laws robustly. This geographic concentration has led to both over-policing, in counterterrorism, and under-policing, in addressing local crime in some cases. USA. The Muslim population in the United States is smaller, around 1 to 2% of the population, and far more diverse, comprising immigrants from the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and native-born African American Muslims. Unlike Europe, there are fewer ethnic enclaves or neighborhoods predominantly populated by Muslims, which reduces the perception of separate communities and makes broad systemic neglect harder to identify. Policing issues. Underpolicing, neglect. UK and Europe. There have been documented cases of police neglect in addressing issues within some Muslim communities, e.g., grooming gangs in the UK, honor-based violence in Sweden or Germany. Authorities have been accused of avoiding prosecution or investigation due to fears of being labeled racist or Islamophobic. USA. There is less evidence of systemic police neglect, specifically toward Muslim communities. Instead, Muslims in the USA more commonly report profiling and over-policing, e.g., surveillance programs, airport detentions, as opposed to neglect. When crimes like honor killings or domestic violence occur, they are typically investigated similarly to cases in other communities. Over-policing, excessive scrutiny. UK and Europe. After terrorist attacks, e.g., London, Paris, Brussels, Muslim communities often face increased surveillance and counter-terrorism measures, but this is sometimes paired with neglect of other crimes, as resources focus on preventing extremism. USA. Post 9/11, Muslims in the USA have been subject to extensive surveillance programs, such as the NYPD's now-defunct Demographics Unit, which monitored mosques, cafes, and schools. The Patriot Act and other counterterrorism measures have disproportionately targeted Muslim communities, leading to accusations of racial profiling and civil rights violations. Community and government dynamics. Community engagement. UK and Europe. In some European countries, strained relations between Muslim communities and law enforcement have made effective policing difficult. Mistrust has grown due to both neglect, e.g., lack of action on grooming gangs, and heavy-handed tactics, e.g., raids and profiling. USA. While similar mistrust exists, efforts to engage Muslim communities through programs like community policing and partnerships with religious leaders have had mixed results. Some Muslim leaders in the USA have collaborated with authorities to counter radicalization, while others criticize these efforts as invasive. Media and political narrative. UK and Europe. The media often focuses on cultural clashes, framing certain crimes, e.g., grooming gangs, honor violence, as tied to Muslim culture. This sometimes deters police from acting, fearing backlash. USA. While anti-Muslim rhetoric exists, the narrative is often focused on national security rather than community-specific crimes. Crimes within Muslim communities, e.g., domestic violence, honor killings, are less sensationalized in mainstream media compared to Europe. Key differences. Aspect UK/Europe USA. Neglect. Fear of being labeled racist leads to neglect in certain crimes, e.g., grooming gangs. Less evidence of systemic neglect, specifically in Muslim communities. Over-policing. Counter-terrorism measures sometimes overshadow local policing needs. Greater focus on counter-terrorism and profiling rather than neglect. Demographics. Concentrated Muslim communities in ethnic enclaves. Diverse, dispersed Muslim population with fewer enclaves. Media narrative. Crimes framed as cultural issues, leading to political sensitivities. Crimes framed within a national security context, less tied to culture. Conclusion. The USA faces different dynamics with its Muslim communities compared to the UK and Europe. While systemic neglect has been a documented issue in the UK, e.g., in addressing grooming gangs or honor-based violence, in the USA, the focus is often on over-policing and surveillance. Both situations highlight the need for balanced, culturally sensitive policing that neither neglects nor unfairly targets specific groups.
Why is it that so many people don't know about this?
There are several reasons why widespread awareness of issues like systemic neglect by police toward Muslim communities, such as the grooming gang scandals in the UK or the surveillance of Muslims in the US, remains limited or misunderstood. These reasons are rooted in media narratives, political sensitivities, public perceptions, and institutional factors. 1. Media coverage and narrative framing. Selective reporting. Media outlets often focus on sensational stories or narratives that align with popular or political agendas. In the case of the grooming gang scandals, media in some countries initially downplayed or avoided reporting on the ethnic or religious backgrounds of the perpetrators to avoid accusations of racism. As a result, public awareness of the full scale of the issue was delayed. Political sensitivity. The media can be hesitant to report on certain issues due to fears of inflaming racial or religious tensions. In the case of grooming gangs or radicalization, the connection to Muslim communities has often been underreported or framed in a way that avoids criticizing a specific religion or ethnicity. This is particularly true in Europe, where there is a higher sensitivity toward issues of immigration and multiculturalism. Mainstream versus alternative media. Alternative media outlets and investigative journalists often play a crucial role in exposing such issues. However, mainstream media may downplay these findings, leading to a slower spread of information to the general public. 2. Political correctness and fear of backlash. Fear of Islamophobia or racism. In many countries, especially in the wake of incidents like 9/11 and subsequent terrorist attacks, there has been a growing fear of being labeled racist or Islamophobic when discussing issues involving Muslim communities. This fear can lead to avoidance or sanitization of important topics, such as grooming gangs or radicalization, because the perpetrators are often from Muslim-majority backgrounds. Multiculturalism and integration concerns. In Europe, the issue is complicated by tensions around multiculturalism. Authorities, including the police and local governments, sometimes downplay the problem because of concerns about undermining social cohesion or sparking backlash against Muslim communities. The reluctance to appear discriminatory can lead to a failure to act when the community's best interests are at stake. 3. Public perception and lack of understanding. Complexity of the issue. Issues like grooming gangs or radicalization are complex and require nuanced understanding. Many people may not realize the extent of these problems because they are often presented in simplified terms or dismissed as outliers rather than systemic issues. This leads to a lack of deeper investigation and a public perception that these problems are not widespread. Victim blaming. In some cases, victims themselves are stigmatized. For example, some victims of grooming gangs or sexual exploitation may be blamed for their own abuse, particularly if they come from vulnerable backgrounds, e.g., foster care, disadvantaged communities. This can prevent open discussion and further obscure the true nature of the problem. Distrust of authorities. Many people lack confidence in the ability or willingness of authorities to tackle sensitive issues, especially when they fear that doing so might disrupt societal or political stability. This distrust can also make it more difficult to spark meaningful public conversation. 4. Inadequate institutional responses. Bureaucratic failures. In some cases, investigations into issues like grooming gangs have been delayed or inadequately addressed due to bureaucratic inefficiencies. For example, in Rotherham, local authorities failed to act on mounting evidence of child exploitation for over a decade. As a result, public knowledge of the scale of the problem only came to light years later, after whistleblowers and investigative journalists exposed the issue. Lack of accountability. When perpetrators are part of a specific group, e.g., Muslim communities, authorities sometimes face pushback when trying to enforce the law. In some cases, the lack of accountability allows these issues to fester, as police and government officials are reluctant to challenge the status quo for fear of appearing biased or targeting a particular group. 5. Social media and echo chambers. Polarized information. Social media has amplified both awareness and misinformation. While alternative media outlets and whistleblowers can use social media to raise awareness, the same platforms can also be used to spread conspiracy theories or stoke divisiveness. This polarization makes it difficult for the general public to arrive at a balanced understanding of complex issues like police neglect or the treatment of Muslim communities. Echo chambers. Social media and internet forums often reinforce existing beliefs, leading to a situation where those with a particular perspective are less likely to be exposed to contradictory information. For example, individuals who believe there is a widespread cover-up of grooming gangs might only engage with content that confirms their beliefs, while those who believe concerns about Islamophobia are overstated might avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. 6. Institutional and government responses. Lack of transparency. Governments may not always prioritize transparency when it comes to sensitive issues that could lead to public unrest or political consequences. For instance, reports on grooming gangs or radicalization may be suppressed or downplayed to avoid political fallout, particularly in election years or when there are significant social tensions. Delays in reform. Even when systemic issues are acknowledged, reforms can take time. Investigations into neglect or over-policing in Muslim communities may be delayed or obstructed due to political resistance, ongoing legal proceedings, or other factors. Conclusion. The lack of widespread knowledge about systemic neglect in applying laws to Muslim communities can be attributed to a combination of factors, including media narratives, political sensitivities, public perception, bureaucratic failures, and the challenges of effectively addressing complex social issues. Greater awareness and action require a balanced approach that encourages transparency, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, while also avoiding the pitfalls of racial or religious stereotyping.
The UK government has been criminalizing people who talk about these things. Why is that happening? And is that happening anywhere else?
The issue of criminalizing speech related to sensitive topics like grooming gangs, Islamic radicalization, or Islamophobia has become a controversial and increasingly complex issue in the UK and in other parts of the world. The criminalization of such speech typically occurs under the banner of hate speech laws or anti-terrorism laws, and it is often framed as a way to protect social cohesion, prevent discrimination, and avoid inflaming tensions. However, this can lead to concerns over freedom of speech and censorship, especially when the lines between legitimate criticism and harmful rhetoric become blurred. Why is the UK government criminalizing speech? Hate speech and anti-extremism laws. In the UK, the Counter-Terrorism and Sentencing Act, 2021, the Terrorism Act, 2000, and other hate speech laws have been used to address extremist content. While these laws are designed to combat terrorism and hate speech, they have sometimes been used to stifle discussions around sensitive issues like grooming gangs or Islamic extremism. These laws are often framed as necessary to maintain social harmony and prevent radicalization, but critics argue they can stifle legitimate debate and lead to censorship. Fear of Islamophobia and racial tensions. The UK government has expressed concern that discussions that highlight the involvement of specific groups, particularly Muslim men in cases like grooming gangs, could fuel Islamophobia and racism. For instance, there have been cases where people have been prosecuted or investigated for comments that are seen as inflammatory or likely to incite hatred or violence. The fear is that highlighting the ethnicity or religion of perpetrators in sensitive contexts could lead to generalized discrimination against entire communities, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and further dividing society. Political correctness and social cohesion. There is an ongoing debate in the UK about the balance between freedom of speech and political correctness. The government often finds itself caught between protecting free speech and maintaining public order. In the case of grooming gangs or other related issues, the government may be trying to prevent the amplification of extremist views and prevent hate speech that could incite violence or fuel racial and religious divisions. The challenge is that sometimes the line between protecting individuals from harm and restricting free speech can become blurred, and some voices may be silenced under the guise of protecting the greater good. The snowflake generation and censorship. The rise of the cancel culture mentality and claims of a snowflake generation has contributed to a climate where people are concerned about being labeled offensive or offensive speech leading to social or legal repercussions. This has created an environment where certain opinions, particularly those criticizing government policies or minority groups, are viewed as potentially harmful, even if those criticisms are valid or factual. Is this happening elsewhere? The criminalization or censorship of speech, particularly regarding sensitive issues like religion, ethnicity, or extremism, is not unique to the UK. Several countries have enacted laws or pursued policies that restrict speech in an effort to maintain social harmony or prevent violence, but these laws can often go too far, leading to limitations on free expression. Other countries where this is happening. France. Freedom of speech is a fiercely debated issue in France, especially concerning secularism and Islamic extremism. The French government has pursued laws that restrict hate speech, particularly in relation to anti-Muslim rhetoric, as well as to prevent radicalization. In response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks and other extremist events, France has passed strict laws on online speech, especially aimed at combating terrorism-related content and anti-Semitism. However, this has led to criticism that such laws suppress legitimate criticism of religious extremism or government policies, particularly when it comes to issues like Muslim integration or immigration. The French government also faces criticism over its burqa ban and laws restricting religious symbols in public spaces, which some view as stifling religious expression and free speech. Germany. Germany has some of the strictest hate speech laws in Europe, particularly related to incitement of hate or defamation. In response to far-right extremism and hate speech, Germany has implemented laws that penalize statements deemed to promote racism, Holocaust denial, and incitement to violence. However, these laws have raised concerns about free speech limitations, particularly when it comes to the ability to criticize or discuss sensitive topics like Islamic extremism or immigration. German authorities have also cracked down on online platforms that host hate speech, which sometimes results in the removal of content that discusses Islamic extremism or migration issues, even if it's framed as legitimate debate or critique. Canada. Canada has laws against hate speech, particularly in relation to racial, religious, or sexual orientation-based discrimination. Under Section 319 of the Criminal Code, people can face criminal charges for inciting hatred or promoting violence against identifiable groups. While Canada's laws are designed to prevent hate speech, they have been criticized by some groups for limiting free speech, particularly regarding discussions around Islam, immigration, and terrorism. Critics argue that some individuals have faced legal action for making statements that critique policies related to Muslim immigration or Islamic radicalization. Australia. Australia has laws that prohibit hate speech and the incitement of violence, particularly concerning racial and religious groups. Laws such as the Racial Discrimination Act prohibit speech that incites hatred or discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or religion. While these laws are aimed at protecting minority groups from hate speech, there have been concerns that they limit free expression, particularly in discussions surrounding Islamic radicalization or immigration policies. New Zealand. New Zealand passed the Hate Speech Bill in 2022, which broadens the scope of laws prohibiting speech that incites hatred against particular groups. While these laws are meant to prevent hate speech and extremism, some critics fear they might suppress speech that criticizes certain religious practices or immigration policies. This debate became more pronounced after the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019, where the government implemented new restrictions on extremist content. Conclusion: the criminalization or suppression of speech on sensitive topics like grooming gangs, Islam, and extremism is not limited to the UK. Countries like France, Germany, Canada, and Australia have also enacted laws to combat hate speech, often in response to rising tensions related to terrorism, racial conflict, or religious extremism. However, the challenge is striking the right balance between preventing hate speech and protecting freedom of expression. Critics argue that laws aimed at curbing hate speech can sometimes stifle legitimate criticism and restrict free debate, especially when discussing complex issues like immigration, radicalization, or social integration.
Again, please compare to the USA. This is what I've been wanting during this entire discussion. You seem to be ignoring this fact.
Apologies for not addressing the comparison to the USA earlier. Let me break down the key differences between how the USA and countries like the UK or France approach the issue of criminalizing speech related to sensitive topics such as Islam, extremism, and radicalization. Freedom of speech in the USA versus the UK and Europe. Legal framework for freedom of speech. USA. First Amendment. The U.S. Constitution guarantees strong protection for free speech through the First Amendment, which states, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press. This makes the USA unique compared to many Western countries, where speech is more regulated. The First Amendment ensures that hate speech or offensive speech about specific groups, including Muslims, is largely protected, so long as it does not incite imminent violence or constitute direct threats. In general, Americans have a wide latitude for discussing sensitive or controversial topics without fear of legal repercussions. Exceptions to free speech: while speech is protected, incitement to violence, defamation, obscenity, and threats are exceptions. However, these exceptions are narrowly defined, making it more difficult to prosecute speech unless it clearly incites immediate harm, e.g., fire in a crowded theater scenarios. UK and Europe. Hate speech laws. In contrast to the USA, many European countries, including the UK, have hate speech laws that restrict speech that is seen as likely to incite violence, discrimination, or hatred against particular groups based on race, religion, sexuality, etc. For example, the UK's Public Order Act, 1986, makes it an offence to incite racial hatred or distribute material that could stir up religious or racial hatred. These laws allow authorities to criminalize speech that is deemed harmful, including speech that targets specific religious communities such as Muslims. This has led to the prosecution of people for things like spreading Islamophobic rhetoric or posting offensive material online, even if the speech does not directly incite violence. Political sensitivities. The UK and many European countries are often concerned about the social cohesion of multicultural societies and may restrict speech to prevent the rise of hate speech, particularly against minority religious groups. The perceived risk is that offensive speech could fuel Islamophobia or racial violence. Criminalization of speech on sensitive topics. The case of Muslims. USA. Free expression on Islam and extremism. In the US, people are free to discuss Islam, criticize Islamic extremism, and even challenge government policies regarding radicalization or terrorism. The First Amendment ensures that such discussions cannot easily be criminalized unless they incite imminent violence. Political and social backlash. While the government cannot criminalize criticism of Islam or any other religion outright, individuals may face social repercussions or public backlash for comments that are seen as hateful or divisive. For example, people who engage in Islamophobic speech might face condemnation from civil rights groups or lose their social media platforms due to terms of service violations. However, these repercussions do not generally extend to criminal charges, except in extreme cases, e.g., making terroristic threats. Surveillance and profiling. While not criminalizing speech directly, the U.S. government has often surveilled Muslim communities and monitored speech related to extremism. After September 11, Muslims in the U.S. faced increased surveillance, and their online activities were heavily monitored under programs like Echelon and PRISM. However, the government has not generally criminalized individuals solely for discussing Islam or extremism unless they engage in actual incitement to violence. UK and Europe. Criminalizing speech. In some European countries, speech about Islam or Islamic extremism can result in criminal charges if it crosses into areas that incite hatred or violence. For example, in the UK, individuals who post material that incites hatred against Muslims or advocate for violence against Muslim communities can face hate crime charges. Chilling effect on speech. In the UK, especially, there has been a chilling effect where some individuals or groups feel that speaking out about sensitive topics, such as grooming gangs, Islamic radicalization, or immigration, could result in legal repercussions or social ostracism. Some critics argue that political correctness has led to the self-censorship of public discourse, particularly regarding issues tied to Muslim communities. High-profile cases. There have been high-profile cases in the UK where individuals have been prosecuted for comments made online, particularly when discussing sensitive topics like Islam or immigration. For example, Tommy Robinson, the founder of the English Defence League, has faced legal challenges for his speeches criticizing Islam. His case, and others like it, highlight the tension between freedom of speech and the enforcement of hate speech laws. Counterterrorism. In the UK, counterterrorism laws also play a role in regulating speech. Prevent, the UK's counterterrorism strategy, has been criticized for targeting Muslim communities in its efforts to prevent extremism. This includes efforts to monitor speech and activity that might indicate radicalization. Some argue that this creates an atmosphere of suspicion where legitimate political discourse about Islamic extremism or immigration is restricted by fear of being labeled as extremist or Islamophobic. Key differences: USA versus UK/Europe. Aspect USA UK/Europe. Free speech protection. First Amendment guarantees robust protection for free speech, including speech that might criticize Islam or Islamic extremism. Hate speech laws and restrictions on speech to prevent incitement to violence or hatred, particularly against religious and ethnic groups. Criminalization of speech. Speech that criticizes Islam or Islamism is largely protected, but individuals may face social backlash or social media bans. Criminalization of speech that incites hate or violence against Muslims or other groups. Surveillance of communities. Surveillance of Muslim communities after September 11. But speech about Islam is not criminalized unless it incites violence. Increased surveillance of Muslim communities and regulation of speech seen as promoting radicalization or hate. Political backlash, public backlash, boycotts, or social media bans for controversial speech, but not generally criminalized. Legal action in some cases for promoting hate speech or inciting violence, especially in high-profile cases. Extremism and terrorism. Surveillance of online activity linked to radicalization, but speech alone is rarely criminalized. Counterterrorism laws may monitor or restrict speech deemed extremist or radicalizing, with more direct penalties for incitement. Conclusion. In the USA, the First Amendment provides robust protections for free speech, including speech critical of Islam or Islamic extremism, with legal limits only on speech that directly incites violence. The UK and much of Europe, however, have stronger hate speech laws that criminalize speech likely to incite hatred or violence, particularly against religious and ethnic minorities. This has led to legal action against individuals who speak on sensitive topics like Islam or radicalization, even if their speech does not incite immediate harm. Thus, freedom of speech is much more restricted in the UK and Europe, particularly around discussions of Muslim communities, while the USA provides broader protections for free expression, even when the subject matter is controversial or inflammatory. However, both countries face challenges related to balancing free speech with preventing harm, particularly in the context of radicalization, extremism, and hate speech.